Okay, welcome everybody. Can you all hear me? Hopefully you can. It's lovely to see so many people here, and it's such an honor to host Srila. I'm really excited about it. I'm Alison Phipps, and I'm professor in the sociology department here at Newcastle. I'm also co-convener with Nikki Godden-Rasul and Tina Sicker, both of whom are also on the call, of the Abolition Feminism for Ending Sexual Violence Collective, which is hosting the talk. The collective is our small attempt to create a space for abolition feminism thinking and doing in the UK Academy. We currently have almost 300 people on our mailing list, and I can put a link in the chat if you want to join our mailing list and are not currently on it. The talk has also been co-sponsored by the Gender Research Group at Newcastle, so we say thank you to them as well. So I've known Srila for a long time. I think it's since 2009, if I'm not wrong, when you must have been fresh out of your PhD at Warwick. Yeah. And I was in awe of Srila even then. I mean, you know, oh my goodness, who is this amazing woman? And now she's professor of sociology at Wits, and she's published 5 books, including the prize-winning Changing the Subject, Feminist and Queer Politics in Neoliberal India. In 2022, she received the inaugural Global South Feminist Scholar Award from the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies section of the International Studies Association. And then last year, Srila won another prize, the Sociological Review Essay Prize, for her paper, Dissonant Intimacies, Coloniality and the Failures of South-South Collaboration. And she gave the Sociological Review annual lecture in December. That paper is open access, and I can again put a link in the chat if anybody wants to read it. Who hasn't done, it's brilliant, so you should definitely read it. This talk is from a book in progress, which builds on the same topic, and it's called Dissonant Intimacies, Doing Transnational Feminism in the Global South. And Srila will focus on a chapter covering decolonising imperatives coming out of the global north and attempts to decolonise feminist publishing. So I'm so excited to hear this. I mean, the rhetoric of decolonisation is ubiquitous now in UK universities, but there are still very few people unpacking what that really means. So I think we're all very pleased to hear from you, Srila. Srila will talk for about 35 minutes and then we'll have Q&A. There should be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens where you can submit your questions directly during the talk, and then I can field some of those afterwards. Or you can put questions in the chat, which I think will just go to me and the other co-hosts of the meeting. And you should also be able to raise your hands as normal afterwards and talk in the meeting. So that's it from me. I'll hand over to you now, Srila, and thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Alison. I mean, I was also actually thinking about when we met, and it must have been FWSA, right? So, and I see actually Stacey here, and that I think we all kind of met thanks to FWSA. And I have to say, Alison, it's interesting because the Times Higher Education has asked me to write something about mentoring and mentors, and although I think people like you were never obviously officially a mentor to me, but I think you kind of modeled what it meant to be a feminist in the academy, you know, and a very supportive colleague and energetic. And I mean, obviously you've gone on to do such bigger things, but I just think back in the day, as you said, I just finished my PhD, and it was just really nice to be part of this community where you could actually see people who, you know, held your hand through things and also spoke up when they needed to. So thank you for that. And
lovely.
yeah, on that note, it's really nice to be here. I see a lot of people I know through different trajectories, including journal editors, including Stacey, who's an editor with me in Feminist Theory, and that's kind of what I want to talk about. So I hope we'll all be able to talk about that because I think this is also something, like you said, you know, something that's on a lot of our mind. Okay, so just to say before I put up the slides, as Alison said, of course, yeah, thank you actually everyone who's joined. I'm sure it's a busy week, so thanks for making the time. As Alison said, this is a book project that I'm doing, which is basically on decolonizing higher education through the lens of transnational feminism. So it's really looking at gender and sexuality studies, mainly across India and South Africa. So the article Alison mentioned, which, by the way, Alison, it did not win the prize. Someone else much more worthy won the prize, but I did do the annual lecture on that topic. So yeah, that article will be part of the book, and basically, it sort of exemplifies the point of the book, which is to slightly shift the gaze from thinking about decolonizing only across the North and the South, and to think of it within and across the South. And each chapter is kind of a different. It's sort of an essay style, and it's about a different dimension of higher education. So there's one chapter on sort of teaching the South in the South, a chapter on research collaborations, a chapter on traveling theory, and so on and so forth. And mainly, like I said, looking at drawing on my own experiences of India and South Africa in thinking about that, right? But this chapter, which is I'm hoping will be the penultimate chapter on feminist publishing, I try and shift the scale and think about the North and what is happening around decolonizing in the North. And that's for two reasons. One, I thought, and I mean, of course, I'd be very interested to hear what you think. I thought a book which is talking about decolonizing can't really talk about what's happening in the North, especially I think in the UK, because it has, as Alison said, has been such a big project. And secondly, because I myself, for some of you who may not know, spent a decade of my life in the UK, where I got my PhD and where I had my first job, and I feel still very much connected to epistemic communities there. And you'll see from the paper, I'm very much part of journals located in the North. So I thought that might be an interesting and conversations there. So it gives me a particular sort of insight, being located in Johannesburg as I am, but also being part of conversations there and what that means and brings to the table. So that's just a brief sort of a way of sort of contextualizing this paper in the broader project, which I hope makes sense. Okay, so I have some slides. Unfortunately, they're quite sloppy because I didn't have time to put all the references in. But if you're interested in anything, please do ask, and I can send you the paper or give you the reference, whatever you're interested in. Okay, where is sorry, let's get rid of, I can get rid of this thing on the top. I just want to make it full screen. Yeah. Can you see the slides? All good? Right, okay. So I'm going to read just so we know I'm on time. So the problems with the current model of academic publishing are too many and too depressing. Well, too depressingly familiar, I think, for a lot of us to reiterate, but in brief and best captured by the term, the academic publishing industrial complex, scientific publishing is concentrated in the hands of a small number of multinational publishing conglomerates who limit access to knowledge to those who can pay in a reader pay model. And that's from Sarah Kember, who's at Goldsmiths and who runs the Goldsmiths Press, is also an editor with me at Feminist Theory. And I'll be using a lot of this one really important article by Sarah. Well, there's several, but this is her inaugural lecture, which I'd encourage you to read. So commercial publishing, as part of the privatization and neoliberalization of higher education, makes scholarship out of reach for most publics. The high premium placed on productivity and commercial viability enables, some would say, through nothing short of extortion and profiteering, produces a monoculture. As Sarah says, and I quote, if publishing continues to be dominated by commercial and professional productivity, if it serves only or mainly Amazon and our CVs, if it becomes any more of a monoculture than it already is, then the book, whether it is in digital or print form, is a hollow commodity. If not dead, then undead. Books about zombies are one thing. Zombie books are quite another. So Kemba is one of a small but growing community of scholars committed to unsettling publishing norms. And she's also a vocal critic of open access. And that's also why I'd encourage you to read this piece for her section on and her arguments around open access, which simply substitutes the reader pay model for an author pay model. Openness in this avatar, she argues, is little more than a commercial enclosure. And I don't know if some of you have been following, I'm sure you have, with a lot more interest than I have, in fact, and I feel very sorry for you about the current REF guidelines around open access. And I'd be very curious and interested to hear your views. But beyond questions of access and accessibility, there are, of course, major problems with academic publishing as it currently stands. Who gets to publish what and where? We know are hardly a set of neutral questions. Publishing reinforces established hierarchies to do with racism, classism, sexism, and divides between the global north and the south. Quality control mechanisms like peer review and citations tend to favor, and here I cite Sarah again, favor the already established author and the already established, tried, tested, applied, and preferably lucrative idea. And yet all academics, whether we are established or not, and whether we are from well-resourced institutions or otherwise, are under pressure to publish in high-ranking journals, determined by global neoliberal metrics and citation counts. These metrics that sustain, as David Mills calls it, epistemic coloniality and an unequal political economy of global higher education serve to exclude feminist and especially Southern feminist knowledge. In fact, for many critical observers, colonialism haunts, and here I quote the Radical Books Collective Manifesto, colonialism haunts the politics of languages, translation, publishing infrastructures, and costs, the politics of distribution and access to books, end quote. So how do feminist journals fare in this landscape? The statistical data provided by one article, which was actually published in Feminist Theory, is eye-opening, even though it confirmed my own experience of editing journals out of the UK and the US. And it also confirms the data that emerges out, that some of these journals have that produced themselves, like Gender and Society. So Gender and Society, which I'm recently on the editorial board of, gives you a whole table of where authors come from and where, countries, etc. It's quite an important database. So this article shows that being in a Northern institution is crucial to getting published in leading journals, and how these journals in turn primarily publish authors from those locales, notwithstanding commitments to diversity, intersectionality, and of course, internationalism. In fact, the Indian Journal of Gender Studies and Feminist Africa very importantly, is entirely open access, while having a regional specification in their title, have a greater diversity of authors' locations than ones that aim for being international. The author finds that it is easier for
Srila is frozen. I am not. Are you?
Have we lost Srila? It's not me, is it?
I can't hear her either.
Okay. Let's just wait a couple of seconds and see if she'll come back. In the meantime, people can certainly. Oh, we've lost her. She'll come back in. You can put some questions in the Q&A if you already have questions. I think the point on open access is incredibly important and provocative, and maybe people have reflections on that. I'm just going to open my email to see if Srila sent me a message. Ah, you're back.
Yeah, so sorry.
That's okay.
Where was I?
You hadn't where if you put your slides back up, I can guide you. You were talking about the
Do you mind
gender and
if I have the
society and the authors.
slides like this? I don't know if it makes sense.
No,
Is that all
that's
right?
fine. Yeah, that's
Okay.
fine. So yeah, you were talking about gender and society and the demographics of
yes.
the authorship, and Feminist Africa being completely open access. Yeah, I think that's where you got to.
Okay. Thank you, and sorry about that. So yes, so basically this author says how concludes by saying that the subfield of feminist research does not differ much from other research in women and gender with respect to the location of authors appearing in main academic works published in the metropole. And again, as is quite sort of not surprising, it's only mainly diasporic authors, so those who have migrated to this academic center, who then manage to publish in some of these northern journals. Okay, so can things change? Can they be different? Yes, say the editors of Gender and Development, in a special issue on decolonization published in 2023 with a very impressive set of authors from around the world. Historically hosted by Oxfam Great Britain, the journal has recently transitioned to a new editorial home in India and is also supported by a whole conglomerate of editors in various parts of the world. The special issue, in fact, emerged out of the need for the editorial team in India to, I quote, take stock of our collective intentions and work towards furthering our decolonial feminist aims among the challenges and pressures of accessing, producing, and publishing knowledge outputs in the so-called global south. So in the collective introduction to the issue, which is presented as a conversation, the editors raise several significant questions about what it means to decolonize academic publishing. What is decolonizing and what is it not? Decolonizing, they insist, is not just about content, but about care. How care can infuse and shape editorial practices and relations, not just with submitting authors, but with each other as editors and reviewers. This caring disposition manifests in the recognition of something as everyday as everyone having to juggle multiple responsibilities, professional, personal, which tend to be undervalued or ignored in academia's productivity-driven culture. Balancing not just multiple work commitments, but also different timelines and time zones were additional challenges. And one of the editors even wonders whether standardized or colonized ways of working are easier than decolonial ones that take greater time, commitment, resources, and energy. Now, a journal that seems to have taken up some of these questions, at least, is Feminist Review, published, as some of you might know, by Sage. It's a very old and established journal in the UK and supported by an independent trust. As with Gender and Development, Feminist Review has undergone a major transition, which also was rooted in a perceived crisis of care, which at least some of the editors felt. The crisis catalyzed a public discussion on a felt chasm between what the journal publicly stood for and what its own internal collective practices were, which some editorial board members felt were far from feminist. Like Gender and Development, the crisis and demand for care serve not to center questions of content alone, but also of process and labor. As the editors say, as the editors say, the work required for Feminist Review to open up feminist imaginaries, not only in what is written in the pages of the journal, but also how we do the work that makes the journal possible. What followed was an overhaul of all aspects of the journal's publishing practice. Concrete steps included the recruitment of a new editorial board with much diversity in terms of race, location, and professional standing, and instituting an honorarium payment system for peer reviewers and editors. Now, as most of us probably know, it's entirely normal to not pay reviewers or editors or submitting authors in another magical sleight of hand by which commercial press publishing basically outsources all labor to academics. Payment was intended to recognize the shadow labor of reviewers, especially in a context where the model of the salaried academic is fast on decline, and I think to a primarily UK-based audience, I don't have to explain what that means. Payment or its lack also impacts the production of feminist scholarship. As the editors again say, many, particularly precarious and independent scholars, may be unable to undertake this work without payment, which in turn limits the field of potential reviewers. This serves to reinforce existing racialized, gender-classed, and ableist hierarchies within academia, whereby established and often tenured academics are continually asked to review new scholarship. This might close down potential avenues of knowledge generation through the exclusion of wider, diverse, and marginalized scholarly communities. Other journals wondered how Feminist Review could afford this model and how sustainable it was. These are questions they answer themselves. Payment comes out of their annual income. Besides, the question of sustainability cannot be a cover for exploitation, they insist. Now, there are other ways in which Feminist Review has taken up the mantle to decolonize. A current editor questioned the need to explain terminology from the global south without the same impetus to do so when it comes to Europe. She felt that these kind of provocations land far easily on the terrain of a feminist journal than they do on mainstream disciplinary journals, which often think of decolonizing as essentially diversifying a British outlet. For her, decolonizing meant going beyond questions of authorship and readership, and especially diversity, to more fundamental ones about how knowledge is produced and how academic conventions and cultures are reshaped. Another new editor felt that caste needed to be included far more in conversations on journal content and practice. As someone from a marginalized group in India, they felt that diversity in editorial composition was key in expanding scholarly debate. And here it's also worth mentioning that Feminist Review was indeed quite unusual in having an open call for recruiting its new editorial board, which I think played quite an important role in allowing those who are marginalized at the periphery at both domestic and international scales to feel included. Okay, feminist journals that are committed to decolonizing have come up with, again, similar challenges and paradoxes. These include being faced with questions like how to remain feminist and more specifically attuned to the needs of Southern feminist researchers, while at the same time needing to survive and thrive in an increasingly competitive and marketized academic world. And that is from the Gender and Development Editorial Board. Or as Feminist Review again puts it, how do we grapple with the tensions of working with publishers, paywalls, academic formats, metrics, and also being a space that doesn't center academia, that is open and accessible, that is community-focused and supportive. Most strikingly, given the extractive and profiteering nature of commercial publishing, how does one turn their back on high-ranking journals and the publishing status quo when it is precisely the more precarious or undervalued academic positions who benefit most from publishing in high-ranked journals? And sorry, that's from an article in a journal called Island Studies, which I've just stuck in there, but I'd be very happy to send you the article if you want to read it. So to opt out of publishing might be too risky for even established academics, let alone early career or Southern ones. It might be available to a very small, privileged group of scholars. So I'm currently part of quite a unique intervention into academic publishing that was faced with precisely this paradox. Started by journal editors in the UK and quickly expanding to include views from Latin America, the African continent, and the US, we call ourselves a federation of feminist journal editors and publishers operating across countries, contexts, and languages. A statement from the initial core group is available online. Simply put, we seek to disrupt the current system of commercial publishing and build new publishing ecologies, infrastructures, and ethics that would prioritize, for instance, collaboration over competition, build diversity and inclusion from an intersectional decolonial feminist standpoint, mitigate against the reproduction of epistemic monocultures, end the exploitation of scholarly labor, and promote instead, and I quote, the fair sharing of finite resources such as time and materials. The goal, as the statement puts it, is nothing less than a reworlding of knowledge itself, away from very narrow neoliberal instrumentalization and operationalization. Yeah, and that's a little bit more from the statement there. Okay, so these are very ambitious goals, which might even be realizable in the present. Just the other day, I heard of yet another mass resignation of editors of a major social science journal over accusations of interference and sabotage by the publisher. The statement of resignation ends with a passionate promise of building an alternative space for that particular epistemic community. And this is only one of several incidents of academics calling quits on parasitic commercial publishers and opting to build alternatives for themselves. That's part of the statement by those editors in terms of the resignation. And some of you might have read it because it was available on social media. As part of the Federation, I attended workshops and meetings with the core and wider group, where we had spirited discussion on how to build a room of our own, as we called it. Amongst the many external challenges, funding being the most pressing, there were also differing agendas, interests, and needs amongst us, the group of editors who had come together. These appear to be rooted in the politics of location and the paradoxes of inclusion. While Northern editors pushed for a radical recalibration of journal publishing, some Southern editors wished to be included into these very channels of global recognition and esteem. So one set of interests were geared to opt out, while others were seeking greater ways to opt in. For instance, Latin American editors made it clear that their route to visibility and gaining greater legitimacy was by publishing in our journals. We, editors of Northern outlets, argued in turn that inclusion does not change systemic constraints. We later reflected on this debate amongst the core group and the impasse it created in our early conversations, as one about the sort of polarization between representation, if you want, and actual transformation, or as Sarah Kember put it, between visibility and corporate capture. Sarah added that the Federation sought to go beyond the hand-wringing around epistemic injustice to which decolonization had sometimes been reduced. So questions like, how can Global South scholars write like us so they can publish like us? The Global South is also hardly one thing, and these spaces were a good reminder of conflicting and even competing internal interests, shaped by distinct local publishing landscapes. Latin America, for instance, has its own open access model, and so questions of accessibility were not as much as a priority for them as it was for some of us. And still, researchers there find it very hard to break through into Anglo-American circuits, largely because of language. So we came away with more questions than we had answers for. How to achieve inclusion and visibility without feeding the commercial publishing beast? Is corporate capture only a global north problem? Do current decolonial debates that center representation and inclusion consider these other dimensions, such as how corporate culture erodes the humanities? Given these distinct needs and desires, born, of course, out of an unequal geopolitics of existing knowledge systems, the building of a transnational feminist collective, let alone a brave new world of academic publishing, seemed far more complicated than what we had assumed. Many Southern scholars want precisely the inclusion and visibility that comes from publishing in high-ranked, globally recognized journals. A new culture of credibility driven by citation metrics makes it even harder for them to opt in, however. For the Ghanaian scholars that David Mills and his colleagues recently interviewed for a book I'd highly recommend, it's on publishing in Africa, really looking at Ghana as a case study, and it's packed with a lot of empirical data and interviews with academics there. So yeah, for these scholars, publishing in the right journal was key to career advancement. And their challenges were also unique. So as one of them is quoted saying, publishing means reconciling contrasting temporalities, rushing to apply for grants, waiting long months for editorial decisions, and delays surrounding publication. And to that, I may just add that in South African universities, there are also huge amounts of distinct pressure, such as the massification of students. So some universities are teaching in the humanities, 700 to 1,000 students. So those kind of pressures, obviously eat into the kind of time that you can spend on research and publication. In my own experience of editing feminist theory, I found that most of the submissions from the global South, I often got quite a few from South Asia, were weak and I was unable to send them out to peer review. They often seem to just simply be extracted from a dissertation chapter, or were just not ready. And they also did not fit the remit of the journal, with having little theoretical reflection on a topic, even though we define theory in capacious ways. The few that ultimately, the area-specific few that made it to the journal were by authors either trained or located in northern universities, or both. One of the special issues that I managed to bring to the journal and see to the end was on Chiclet in Africa, which was edited by a colleague at WITS and another colleague at the University of Johannesburg. The issue featured almost entirely authors who were located in South African institutions. But it's worth mentioning here that both guest editors were trained in the US, and that they liaised with two editors of the journal who were both trained, and one was located in the UK. And we were all located, well, the guest editors and myself, in South African universities at the time. At other times, however, we may overestimate the desire to be included on part of Southern scholars. An editor of feminist and sociology journals in the UK, who I spoke to, talked of the many meetings in which she had sat, where decolonization was framed as inclusion, including Southern scholars. And she asked very simply in turn, why? Why would they wish to be included? What's in it for them? Similarly, my own impulse to establish a new book series with the UK University Press seemed to misrecognize the conditions that produce specific desires to be included, and into what kinds of circuits of recognition. My co-editor and I started the series to attract and provide space to authors from the South, like our own South African university. Early career scholars in this locale tend to reach far more from local presses than they do international ones. With these dynamics of access, circulation, and recognition in mind, my colleague and I intentionally approached Manchester University Press. However, we received little interest from our own colleagues, whether early or senior, and an overwhelming amount of interest and proposals from those who had just completed a PhD in the UK. The pressures of a highly precarious job market meant that these scholars were looking for avenues for publishing their first monograph with a far greater sense of urgency and intensity than those at a similar career stage at WITS University, for instance. Academic temporalities greatly differ, even in so-called neoliberal universities. It also turned out that books published by Manchester were basically inaccessible to those who we envisioned to be our primary audience, scholars and students in the South. The books were expensive, and I mean, they would be considered even expensive even by standards in the UK, at least until they come out in paperback. Our transnational ambitions began to sound quite worrying very quickly. If anything, they recentered the hegemony of the North in global publishing, making content that drew from Southern data and analysis seem entirely out of the reach for its producers and primary consumers in, let's say, places like South Asia or South Africa. Given shrinking local markets, it was also not easy to produce co-publications with Southern presses, or at least take that for granted. Finally, it's also the case that researchers located in South Africa, and even in India to a certain extent, tend to reach for names most popular and recognizable in local scholarly ecosystems. In South Africa, this includes the several local university presses that the country hosts, like UKZN, UNISA, and Wits Press. In India, it's often Oxford and Cambridge, and most recently, but increasingly Routledge. For a first generation of or for a first generation Black South African academic or author, being published by Wits University Press, which is distributed internationally by NYU Press, may seem a more worthy way of gaining legitimacy and recognition than other international indicators of prestige. Habiba Badroun describes how difficult it was to gain recognition for her monograph published by Wits University Press for tenure in the US, however. So Habiba is a South African poet and scholar who now works at Penn State, and this is a reflective piece that she's written for a forthcoming book, which some of us have contributed to here in South Africa. Badroun, given these inequalities, so basically, to cut a long story short, they felt that a book published by a South African press didn't really cut it for tenure in the US. Badroun demands the following then, given these inequities. She says, those of you who are authors and members of promotion and tenure committees, make it your job to ensure that excellent African publishers are recognized as producers of vital knowledge. And Sarah Kember proposes something similar when it comes back to that paradox of opting in or opting out. She says, until we change the criteria for employment, promotion, and auditing, I have advocated not so much a boycott, but a rerouting of labor to less exploitative publishers over whom we have far more control. I just want to pause here and also flag that it is really also worth, I've mostly drawn on experiences from the UK, which is where I'm really connected to. But of course, I do have connections to the US, and I also did publish a book with the US University Press. But what Habiba talks about also suggests to us how these ecosystems, as I like to call them, are so distinct. So, for tenure in the US, the gold standard is a US University Press, right? So I think, again, it's worth mentioning, how distinct these are, and how, again, the North-South sort of operates with a slight flattening, which I'll come back to. Okay, I'm coming to the end. So in the longer version of this chapter, and being quite inspired by Habiba's reflections, I too reflect on my own publishing trajectory, which has included 2 monographs so far. A first monograph, which was my PhD, which was published by Oxford University Press, India, and another book that I published 10 years later, which was published by the US Duke University Press, right? And I use the story of the 2 monographs, but also an edited volume, to reflect on how the geopolitics of knowledge production and publishing not only shaped, but haunted the fate of these books. So a quick anecdote is that when I published with Oxford University Press, and I went to a conference in the US, annual conference. Those of you who do South Asia Studies will know it's the annual South Asia Studies conference in Madison. Also because, just to tell people who don't know a lot about my work, I straddle area studies, so South Asia studies and gender and sexuality. And the US is really the holy grail for South Asia studies. So after I published this book, I went to a conference. Oh, God, sorry. So sorry about my dog. I'm just going to throw him out just once. Sorry about that. Pleasures of working from home. So I went to the US and I had just published this book, and someone asked me, so who published your book? And I said, Oxford. And she said, which Oxford? And it was really interesting to me how, a good reminder about how Oxford in Delhi, or God forbid Lahore, is not, of course, the same as Oxford in, in US or indeed in the UK, right? So, so that's just just on the side. But basically, what I talk about in that last bit is how the Oxford book circulated primarily amongst audiences in India because it was published in India and it was sold in Indian rupees. But it didn't circulate as wildly elsewhere. I mean, it only got reviews in British journals because I kind of forced my friends to review it. So it certainly didn't bring me a lot of recognition or inclusion. I mean, maybe a little bit in the UK, but certainly not in the US, which I said was really the seat of power when it comes to South Asian studies. And in sharp contrast, the Duke University Press book, of course, brought me enormous recognition in the US. The book has won 2 prizes from professional associations, which are international, but really located in the US. And all of that suggests, again, this, ways in which you gain esteem and recognition and where your book really circulates. And even though it's in paperback and it's under like $25, it's still basically unaffordable to people outside of the US, especially in, India, which is where the book's data comes from. So again, it's a peculiar way in which the book brought me recognition and esteem, but it excluded it sort of excluded me from accessing my most ideal readers, which would be in South Asia and South Africa as well. Now, while I was on a sabbatical leave in 2022, I began to think of my next monograph, which is this volume of essays on decolonizing higher education. In the wake of the student movements that had taken place in South Africa over 2015 and 2016, Wits University Press was crafting critical conversations on decolonizing higher education, besides giving voice to a whole new generation of feminists, some of whom who had emerged out of the student movements, or certainly who had fed back into very pivotal conversations on gender and sexuality. I thus saw the possibility of being included in a conversation that a particular press was at the forefront of curating. And of course, I thought, how could I not publish a book which is really about decolonization and Southern knowledges, not in a Southern press, really. Besides, Wits University Press produced consistently outstanding books, which are both beautiful to hold and feel, and have established robust networks of circulation, both local and international. And I also felt quite strongly that nothing stops international press, including some of the presses that I've worked with, from purchasing rights from Wits, because it is always the other way around, which obviously distinctly disadvantages the local press. But as ever, there is a catch in a clear instance of the ways in which we in the South continue to be far more epistemically oriented to the North than to other Southern locales. Wits Press does not have a distributor in India. There is clearly still a very long way to go when it comes to South-South knowledge production and exchange, which is in fact the subject of the book. So in conclusion, decolonizing feminist publishing requires everything from redistribution, from the extractive, exclusionary, unequal and uncaring practices of commercial publishing to a rewording, indeed. My brief reflections, which are absolutely not my own, they're all in collaboration and in collective thinking and ongoing conversation with other colleagues in the business, suggest that the obstacles to materializing new homes and futures for feminist publishing are not simply epistemic. The first step of diagnosing the problem, the colonial underpinnings of knowledge economies and its exacerbation in the current publishing industrial complex, is not a difficult one. But the creation of new homes has raised more questions than answers, rooted at times in disparate, even incommensurate needs and desires. I don't think the nature of this incommensurability can be reduced to an overarching North-South divide that is purely colonial in nature or global in politics. I hope the brief evidence I've presented here suggests that power structures at different scales, domestic, regional, international, shape researchers' orientations, priorities, and practices when it comes to publishing. The North-South framing may in fact be slightly reductive given the heterogeneity that exists within the South itself. And it is from this heterogeneity that we must begin when we consider both a dismantling of current publishing regimes and the urgent building of alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Srila, and thank you for coming back in after you were thrown out by the internet. I mean, that was so great, and that's just everything that I've come to expect from you. You're so incisive with your analysis, and you're not afraid either. I mean, you make me feel brave because you're not afraid to ask the difficult questions or say the difficult things. And I'm thinking especially about the open access point you made, but you know, all of it, I mean, it's a necessary intervention anyway, but it's especially timely given everything that's going on in academic publishing at the moment, because I'm increasingly wondering if academic publishing is at all sustainable, which makes it the perfect time really to have these conversations about building a room of our own, as you say. And I really felt what you said, because I've given so many pieces of advice to early career colleagues recently on publishing, and some of those colleagues are on this call, and you do feel like you're doing the devil's work. You do, but this is how they're going to succeed or even just survive. And that tension between kind of opting out and opting in to these colonial knowledge economies and how that's structured by the global power relations, and perhaps not in the ways that you might expect. I thought you really kind of captured that so well. So I'm going to open up to some questions in a minute, but I have one for you to kick off. And I know you don't have any answers, but do you have any thoughts on kind of next steps, you know, for you as a journal editor or for the federation that you're part of? And also, you know, what, if anything, can colleagues like me, senior colleagues in the global north who are not journal editors at present, what can we usefully do? Sorry.
I know, absolutely. And really, I don't know. I think we have to, like, as academics, just stop saying, which I used to routinely, we don't do solutions.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Diagnosis.
I don't know. Yeah.
Someone else must do solutions. No, I do think there are models, and part of, I think, this chapter has to actually look at those seriously. So I think what Sarah's doing with Goldsmiths Press, for instance, you know, is one of those models, and it's part of like other, I mean, again, I really need to pick her brains on this, but other like commons, you know, other humanities commons. So so I think there is a way in which people are trying to do things by reaching out and building other kind of collectives, right? And I think that's a powerful thing to do. And obviously that's also, you know, what we're trying to do in our own little way with this federation is to get people together. So one of the things we are hoping to do this year, I mean, we've had a little bit of a slow time. Obviously, we're all doing this on a voluntary basis. I mean, in a case that wasn't obvious, right? So energies ebb and flow. But at the moment, what we're hoping to do is have a set of webinars, which, I mean, I don't think they're really meant to be super public facing, but it's really for us to invite people who we think are building different models and have them talk to us. So for instance, Feminist Africa has done really well as being completely, it's completely open access. But here's the catch, it's got money from the Ford Foundation. So I think, but anyway, it would still be good to have a journal like that. And then there have been some other examples. So Rope, is that how you pronounce it? ROAPE has also now withdrawn from, it must have been Sage or Taylor and Francis. So yeah, I mean, Feminist Review as well, in terms of, I mean, not opting out of commercial publishing, but at least the transition they've been through, I think they would also be a great to speak to. So yeah, so that's one of the things I think is important: knowledge sharing, building community, information sharing. And then, I don't know, I feel like, as you know, I mean, for senior scholars, I do think it's worth thinking about, you know, how do you change criteria?
Yes.
I think probably it feels quite impossible in your context, but maybe it's a little more possible in my context. But
yes.
But yeah, and also I thought, for instance, after I got promoted, I thought, well, do I really need to publish another journal article?
Yeah.
Maybe I can do, I mean, it makes no difference, but maybe if I can, maybe I can opt out, but then of course, my university has now signed a huge memorandum with Elsevier. So we now have open access coming out of everywhere. And I think that's also really interesting, because I think now WITS has more open access than probably a smaller university in Europe. And obviously much more than other universities in South Africa. So it's also really interesting, right? How universities are not similar in the same field and across fields.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
but
and
I'd like to hear what other people think, especially, I think, I'd like to think we're thinking about similar things, some of us here. So yeah, please do share.
Absolutely. So feel free to turn on your cameras and raise your hands. And there's a couple of questions in the Q&A. So if you go to the bottom, there's the Q&A.
Yes.
So there's the chat and there's the Q&A. I'm not sure whether it's the best thing to have them both. It was a bit of an experiment, but actually I think you've answered part of the first question from Iman, which is any suggestions for a woman of colour PhD student on where to publish my thesis research without giving it to colonizers. I mean, Iman, if you do want to put your camera on and chat with Srila in person, you feel free. If not, then we can deal with the question anyway. Any other thoughts on not giving your thesis to colonizers?
Well, send it to feminist theory.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah, I can see there's some thoughts and reflections in the chat and some here.
Yes.
But I'm just looking at the second question here. I don't know if Jana, would you like to ask the question? Coming from...
Yeah, I think I've had a thumb. I think Jana might be.
Yeah, this is the way we read knowledge claims in relation to who they're coming from. Yeah, I think that's a really good question, actually.
Do you want to ask your question?
Hello.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
There you are. Hi.
Hello, nice to see you. I was in transport, so it took me a while to actually go back to where I could turn it on. I mean, it's in writing, so basically, what I'm referring to is the fact that, willy-nilly, whether we like it or not, I think it makes sense to acknowledge that we sometimes outsource all moral responsibility for the state in which academic publishing is to markets or publishers. So basically, essentially to corporations. So we basically say it's academic capitalism to blame. And if only we could undo the intersection between marketization and obviously longer legacies of colonialism, which is also kind of implied in the history of capitalism, then everything would be fine. I'm being slightly facetious here, but in a lot of ways we tend to assume that once we would sort of disrupt those logics, people would start behaving in truly epistemically inclusive and equitable ways. And I'm wondering, how that squares with the fact that we know that in a manner of speaking in a context of abundance, so when there is this, oversupply of knowledge claims of different sorts, some kind of sorting is inevitable. And sadly, that sorting is most likely going to follow some kind of biased logic, or is going to follow a set of epistemic biases, because that is sadly what most people have been inducted in. So I'm just curious, to hear you say a bit more about that, in the sense of, what happens when we read, for instance, knowledge claims by, say, someone who is a woman and writing from a space in Africa as being about feminist theory and or being from area studies, whereas we read knowledge claims, by white men coming from the global north, including England, as being about theory and being about the world in general, right? And I think often that kind of logic is not perpetuated only by regional designation of journals or publishers or editors, but it's actually perpetuated by the way that we read knowledge claims ourselves, right? So what are they about in relation to who or how we read the identity of the person they're coming from? I don't know if this makes sense. I understand it's a long and complex question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? And it also obviously suggests how, publishing can't be thought of in a silo outside of curriculum reform, outside of, like how are we, or citations or any of that, right? So what, and I don't know, I don't think it is just sort of the, African female scholar on the one hand and white male theorist on the other hand, right? Because it's also about the ways in which I think we teach or produce or think of as feminist theory. So I teach a course called Feminist Theory, and I spend the first week trying to unpack, well, what is theory, right? And, could it be poetry? Could it be diaries? Could it, what would it look like, right? And where is it from, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think it's a generative time. I don't know, I'd be curious what people think in different parts of the world. But I felt like here after the student movements, when the whole there's a small moment before decolonization got completely co-opted by our university heads. It felt like there were quite robust discussions around these questions, right? On like, what is theory, what is knowledge, and so on and so forth, and a way of really trying to, I think, reshape some of that. So, but some of that is sustained and some of that hasn't, and it's sort of collapsed back. But I'd like to think that at least in the UK, from some of the things I've seen in the distance, that students have been more interested in asking those questions, and certainly, trying to curate spaces maybe where you're thinking about not just sort of representation in terms of who you invite, but also how that shifts what we think of, knowledge, and from where. I mean, I know that's not really answering your question, because I think it's quite a big question. But I do really like the point about outsourcing responsibility to academic capitalism. That's well said, because I also think I did a version of this to colleagues here, and that was their frustration. I think they thought it was really, Elsevier is the problem, and that's basically it. And, there's no, as one of my colleagues and friends put it here, there's no grace out of this mess, like, giving it over and that's it. And and I think that's really, for me, that's the more bigger takeaway, how to actually not frame it in a way that seems like that's just the problem and that's it. So so thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jana. There's been a request in the chat to expand a little bit on what you said about open access. Is there a website for the Federation of Feminist Publishers that you mentioned?
Well, I can share a link to the statement, which was actually shared on the Sociological Review blog.
Okay. And somebody shared in the chat a statement after open access, which was at the end of is that the one? Okay. Yeah, if you could share a link to it, but maybe just speak to that a little bit more, because I think in the UK we're so kind of inured to thinking about open access as a good thing. It's quite challenging, so I think it would be good to hear more about that.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm also curious about what people think, right? Because obviously it's a good thing, but who's paying for it?
Yeah.
So if you're not, for instance, sitting on a fancy grant, or your institution doesn't have an automatic agreement, I don't know, I'm genuinely asking, like, who pay whatever, like £10,000 maybe to do a monograph, open access? And if, for instance, your book is not selected by Knowledge Unlatched or something like that, I mean, I feel like all of this is still very much dictated and dominated by commercial interests. So, and Sarah makes the really important argument about how, so the question of open access, open for who? And the more it's sort of linked to who has that money, whether that's institutions or individual researchers, it will also eliminate knowledge produced by those who can't, right? So again, we have the danger of this monoculture, or like an epistemic monoculture. So I don't know what that specific, but I'm happy for people to defend open access too. But I don't know. I think it's I mean, can you imagine how much, if it's about whatever, like 7,000 thousands of pounds, how that translates?
No, absolutely.
Where,
Yeah.
it's kind of, it's mad, isn't it? I don't know.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think Carenza put something in the chat about having an SI in a journal, and the only paper that was not OA was by ECR colleagues from Mexico because they
Yes,
couldn't afford the
indeed.
article
Yeah,
charge. Absolutely. Does
yeah.
anybody else have any thoughts on open access?
Yeah, and I imagine there the rest of you probably had it because your institution could pay that bill, right?
Mm,
And you know what? The other thing I want to say is that it's also where resources are being directed to. So now, for instance, WITS is very pleased that it's giving us so much open access. But my question is, what is that money being redirected from?
yes.
I mean, that's a huge amount of probably the library budget, right?
Yeah,
Or some kind
absolutely.
of budget, which is basically going for us to be able to access the public good, to access, publicly funded research.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I mean, it cannot just be the end of the conversation that, now this knowledge is open, right? Because someone is paying for that, and that's taking away from something else that could be paid for in a moment of hugely scarce resources.
Yeah. It does make me think of what Moten and Harney write about radical scholarship as theft.
Yes.
And the idea of maybe it shouldn't be open access, or maybe we should make it open access. I mean, I always send my publications to anybody who asks for them, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And maybe that is in fact a better model than the corporatized OA. Or we've got some thoughts in the chat here on OA. Please feel free to put your cameras on and say things if you would like to. So Erin's got something in here about independent scholars as well, in the North too.
Yeah, totally.
So many people. Yeah, absolutely. Raf,
yes, exactly.
yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's something from Sarah.
Intersectionality of struggles, forced to sit with each other. Well, I don't know. What do people think about, or about doing things differently at a very individual level? Like, how many of you actually? I know actually the job pressures are just really bad and way worse than. Oh, there's a question. Actually,
So Iman, Iman, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much once again. Like, it was such an informative talk for me, especially as I'm a third-year PhD researcher at Loughborough University, and I'm a Muslim woman of color as well too. And it's just so fascinating because I'm doing my PhD research on decolonising university curriculum, but then I have to take into account of everything because we're being shaped by literally society in general, and the ongoing discourses that are especially being pushed by the government and their agendas, and looking into how does that influence academia. I think, to sort of answer your question about how do we change things on a radical level, so myself and some of my colleagues from a research centre based in Loughborough, we've been trying to do things like freedom schools. So, the 1960s civil rights movement, where they were empowering Black children to be the next generation of leaders, but, from a very so-called radical perspective. And then, we had all these different groups coming out of, the REC, the Race Equality Charter funding, but then they all got shut down because then we actually started to implement our research into practice, because we were actually, why are you doing things why do these normative practices exist? You need to stop doing that. And then if, actual groups have been shut down, they just somehow everything stopped existing, and we're we don't have any spaces anymore. And it's just even more problematic for PhD students, especially of color, because that's where the talent pipeline, breaks off. It suddenly becomes so white at the PhD level because we can't be ourselves in these spaces. And especially for me, a Muslim woman of color as well, me just existing is so radical in itself in higher education. But then on top of me challenging pretty much everything, it's just we're immediately being shut down, pushed out. And then I'm sort of feeling to the point of we need to make our own school or our own university in the UK, because it's impossible to be in the structures because they just want you to assimilate.
and like I'm really like, and then I was also thinking about this point too about segregation and desegregation. And I was reading these amazing arguments by in the 1960s when, you know, the US was you know, trying to start assimilating black communities into the US. I was reading Black scholar arguments like actually that was really disastrous because they had broken down the Black ecosystems of excellence, including projects like the Freedom School, in order for them to assimilate and co-op. So like I'm starting to think like, you know, in the UK, like do us as scholars, do we need to actually segregate ourselves and make our own spaces again, or do we continue being forced into assimilating to a certain degree in current structures? And you know, when our you know, families started immigrating into this country as well too, like we had no choice but to make schools for Black and brown children because the school system was rejecting us. And I'm just seeing this pattern play out again. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts about, you know, the whole, you know, point of segregation and desegregation, as, and is segregation actually like a really bad thing or not?
Thank you, Iman.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like Alison might be better placed to answer that because, yeah, I feel quite lucky I'm not in the UK at the moment. But I don't know. I suppose, Alison, like as a more senior scholar, do you think there's room to maneuver within the system? Because I think that's maybe the broader question to influence ref. I mean, so for instance, currently, I think what I saw was they're asking for consultations on the new guidelines. So do you get the sense they will take that seriously if people actually, yeah.
Yes and no. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that there is room to influence some of these processes. And I do, you know, I mean, I think what you said just before and then Iman's question is, you know, it's kind of, do we try to do acts of individual resistance within a kind of broader assimilation, or do we just self-segregate and try and do something different? And maybe, I don't know, maybe we need a bit of both.
Yeah.
You know, it is possible to influence bits of ref, and I led the ref in my last institution at Sussex before I left. I was the ref lead in charge of our submission, and I think I did it with as little kind of pain involved to my colleagues as I could, and we did all right, you know. So I think that as far as that could be considered an achievement, you can do things like that. I do think there are individual people involved in ref who aren't evil, you know, and I think seeing it as a kind of epic battle between good and evil, Game of Thrones style, is probably not particularly helpful. Having said that, there is a limit to what you can do within the system. Definitely. There's a few more questions in the chat which kind of are along these lines as well.
If I can just answer the question by Shana Jain from India. So it's really interesting, right? Like if we think of Shana and Molly's questions just alongside. So Shana, I think the problem, yeah, definitely with you know, Indian universities, like it is in South African universities, is often there is a lack of training. You know, there is a lack of training with, or you know, more than lack of training, I think there's an absence of the soft skills that you need to publish a journal article. So I do now like professional training with graduate students here, where I you know, I show, and of course, I mean, this is true in the UK too. It's not to say that all over in the North they get the similar kind of training. I think it varies as well, right? But I think they potentially get a bit more than maybe we get. So anyway, so I take graduate students through the whole process, right? About how do you do a journal? Like, what is the process? What happens to your journal article when it goes into the, you know, into Manuscript Central or wherever? And incidentally, I also did a session online for, I don't know if you know the Doing Sociology platform in India, so I did one there. And it was really interesting because like a lot of the questions, it felt like people really needed to publish, you know. So students were asking questions like, should I publish my master's dissertation? And again, that suggests to me how much of, you know, how much everyone is in the same kind of mode of publish or perish, and this real anxiety about not making it, right? And then, of course, there's what I was presenting as a bit of a paradox, where we're actually saying, well, we shouldn't publish, we shouldn't, I mean, not shouldn't publish, but we should direct, like Sarah says, our labor and our energy elsewhere, because commercial publishing is unethical, unsustainable, etc., etc. So yeah, but so what happens in the meantime? So I do think we're working at, again, to different scales and to different needs. And it is, yeah, it feels quite, I don't know, quite hard, I think, to juggle all of that. Because I think the second one about ref is, again, that thing of, ECRs can produce really quickly, let's make it all open access, and then that's sort of, profitable, as it were. Yeah, there's someone else who's asked about, oh, thanks for sharing that link, Alison, about a percentage of regular publications for ECR scholars, women. And I mean, I'm curious, like, why, I mean, where would, for instance, so would that be in the North? Where would that percentage, do you know what I mean? Like I mean, it feels here this is more a labor issue than a identity issue, to make a crude distinction, which we know is sort of false and slippery. But, because really the people who would not benefit from open access are the people who are not employed, right?
Yes.
They're not employed, so they will not have or they're employed in an institution that cannot afford open access. It's not that they are minorities because of their sexuality or indigeneity. Of course, those things map onto each other, right? So here, for instance, in South Africa, Wits University is a better resourced and a more elite university than some, like the University of Zululand or some other kind of university, which have been what are called like historically Black universities. But again, identity does not map easily, because Wits University is 90% Black. Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Thank
sorry,
you so
but go ahead. Yeah, I mean, since you're on, just maybe you want to say.
Yeah, I do have to run off, precarious work and all that. But yeah, no, thank you so much for a great talk. And I think what I was thinking is about a bit of what you were saying earlier, that actually the way the system works skews who has access to, publishing, and who has access to, getting their work out there. And I was thinking about how, like, an analogy, I suppose, with things like housing, for example, in the UK, where you have, a percentage, for example, of some housing that has to be affordable housing. And I was thinking, oh my God, could something like this be implemented in publishing, where the publishers, okay, if you're going to charge this for open access, to actually make a percentage of this affordable publishing, or, free open access for people who may otherwise be eliminated from the whole system because they can't afford, or their institutions are not able to pay, like the example someone gave earlier about someone who was from Mexico and couldn't get their article open access. I mean, I'm just trying to come up with ideas. I also think that it's really hard to have solutions, but it's nice to
I do think publishers try, and I think publishers can sometimes make those decisions, and I think that's much more in the world of books than journals, maybe, where, a publisher can try and fundraise to make something open access, or within the constraints that they work with, or can try and say, well, if if so many chapters are open access, something isn't, then they can raise funds or something like that. I think for the journals, which are the really tricky and difficult bit, it makes more sense to have much more of the radical, like, whole editorial board resigns. And the more people do it in the science, the better. Humanity makes a difference. But if you have a major science journal saying, like, sorry, I was going to say, to Elsevier, that, I think that, though, that stuff could be like game changer, because that maybe that might really mean something.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We should wind up now because we've run slightly over, but that was so great. Such a good discussion. And yeah, thank you so much to Srila for a really interesting talk, a really inspiring talk. And yeah, let's get all the science editors to resign. Excellent. Good plan.
Very doable.
Very doable. Let's go tie ourselves to something. Excellent. Okay. So thanks
Okay.
everyone, and we will put the recording on our website. Srila, could we also share your slides with it? Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
Yeah,
I think they're very good, but sure. Yeah.
that would be great. Yeah, lovely.
Look very quickly at the comments just here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Please feel free to email me. I mean, as you can see, this is work in progress. So I'd very much like to hear your and just to continue the conversation. It's also labor in progress. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.